Welcome to Rethinking Youth Ministry, where each week we hope to raise the bar for youth ministry by asking questions, interviewing thinkers, and having real, honest conversations about what it looks like to lead the next generation. I'm Sarah, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Chef.
Hey, everybody.
Crystal.
Hey there.
And Ashley.
Hey.
And today on Rethinking Youth Ministry, we're going to be discussing a question we get all the time as a curriculum company, and that is, should middle school and high school environments be separate or combined in ministry?
Man, at the
Crystal?
Yes, hello. Gosh, as the high school person, selfishly, I'm like, yeah, I think they should be separated because when middle schoolers show up, high schoolers aren't.
Okay.
And especially as they get older, they stop showing up. In the first church where I was volunteering, I felt like maybe every 6 months or every year, somebody got the bright idea that we would either separate them or combine them.
Yes.
Whatever was happening, we had to do something different. And every time we combined them, it was less logistically complicated and more relationally complicated. And we lost high schoolers every single time.
But didn't you find in a smaller church context that when you have them combined, there's a sense of energy that comes from having more numbers? Mm-hmm. Did you find that to be the case in the times that you guys were combined? Did that improve?
I mean, that was always the motivating factor, right? Especially as you have a smaller group of students, you get as many bodies in the room as you
possible
can
to fill up the room
to create energy. And middle schoolers create 17 times the amount of energy.
That's what's so beautiful about them.
No, it always creates more energy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, then you have moms who call and say, hey, my 6th grade daughter was talking to a 12th grade boy when I picked her up tonight. How do you feel about that? And I'm like, terrible. I feel terrible about that. I have no idea what to do with it.
Yeah.
So, Ash,
Yes.
you're the middle school person, but you you worked at a very large church and a not as large church, although it was still a pretty big church, wasn't it? What do you think?
I mean, I think these should be separate because I think middle school students are asking different questions and their needs are different. The way you communicate to them is different. Their attention span is different. Their behaviors are different. Their smells are different. Yeah.
So real.
Their smells are the same. They're just not bathed. So
They're not covered in deodorant.
yeah.
Or they're covered in
Too much.
That's
Axe,
true.
body spray.
I think that if they're so this is so easy for me to say, yes, I think they should be separate if I'm thinking like based on developmental age, because I think it's so easy when a middle school and a high school group is combined that you almost miss the opportunity to minister to middle school students where they are because your focus is always going to lean towards the older kids in the room. If you don't want them to leave, of course. Right. But I also know that what it takes to actually split the environments is a lot of people, a lot of space, a lot of money, resources. Yeah. And that's just not reality for a lot of churches.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're saying to somebody who has limited space, double it, and limited resources, double it, and limited volunteers, double them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a church of about 45 people, including the kids and everything else. So had we split them, the two of us would be in separate rooms or, some Sundays or however it was. But I remember, being moved to the student room and there were 2 rooms downstairs and a nursery upstairs, like in the basement, cinder block, stuff. And just what it was like to be in the room with those older kids. And then it was my dad, volunteer, who was, who had stepped in. And then we moved to a huge church, which I think there were, like 200 or 300 people there on a Sunday, which was huge to me then. And it is a big church. It's a very big church for the average, I guess. And we had our own youth group of, I believe it was still middle school and high school. But again, volunteer youth pastors, and they did their best to handle the range of kids in the room. But, to your point, Crystal, like 6th grade boys and 12-year-old girls, or 12th grade girls.
Right. Very different.
Yeah. Well, and 6th grade girls. 6th grade boys and 6th grade girls, different. So 12th grade girls, obviously. But then I went to North Point, where we had enough kids to do that and have separate even rooms, which was... great in a lot of ways. And what you're saying, Ash, is exactly right. Like, I could speak to them, In fact, there were parts of me, like if I had all the money and time in the world, I'd probably pull 4th and 5th grade out or
interesting. Okay.
Sixth grade by itself.
I think fifth and sixth grade I might pull out, or maybe just sixth by itself, which we tried actually for a season at North Point, and it worked great. But when we went to the other campuses, it wasn't something that we could really keep up. I mean, it's just got so expensive. So in reality, we could make that argument. So we're just in this tension of, what do you do? I mean, I talk to folks all the time who work in churches where they didn't build a separate youth room because they have one youth room and they're going to meet on another day of the week, you know? Or
Which for the staff is really tough.
Right. Or they just have one youth room. And so it's a decision not to serve somebody during, what might be an ideal time. Obviously, money is an issue. And then just numbers are an issue. Like if there are just 10 of you or 6 of you, then, what do you do? But to your point, Crystal, you're in attention. Like if there are 10 of you, but only 4 of you show up because, the 4 young kids show up because the older ones don't want to hang out, then what do you do? It's it's tough.
Do you feel like there is a number that's kind of like the critical mass number? Like once your ministry, either size ministry or either middle school or high school gets to this number, then you should separate.
Well, I do actually think there's a number, but I also think
depends on the size room.
Yes and no. But I mean, I feel like, a ministry doesn't have to be, worship and it can be just folks sitting in a room and talking. I mean, that's realistic, or playing games or whatever you've got to make it work. But I feel like it's not necessarily, again, for the model, it depends, but really for relationships, I think it depends. And for me, that's where I define the number. Right. I feel like you start with genders. Because you need, for students, you need to have separate groups based on genders. And if you have 2 kids and an adult, that's a group. Right. And if you have 1 girl and an adult, that's a group. But the first question I would ask her is, do you have any friends you can bring so that we can begin to have some community or whatever it is? But you start with gender, and then hopefully as you get older, or as you grow and as people feel more connected to the relationship, they come more often, which means your attendance goes up and you've got more kids in the room. The next split, I think, then is middle and high school. So you have 4 groups: a middle school boys group, a high school boys group, a middle school girls group, a high school girls group. Or you have a middle school girls group and a high school girls group and just 1 guys group, because, whatever you need to do to separate it there, because the discussions are just going to be different. And from there, you
so that's assuming you could have 1 talk being given to both.
Well, and I think there's 1,000 ways to solve that problem. Yeah. I did some work with a church in South Africa. They weren't big enough to have separate environments. But what they would do is they would have worship together so that there was critical mass in the room. I think the idea of critical mass with students is a legitimate strategy. It's a real thing. Kids want kids in the room. And then they'd separate out into middle and high school for the talk. And the thing about, that church was they understood something, is that many churches I actually work with can't get past, was that you can actually find volunteers to do the talk, or to if you can find good content, you can actually have some folks do the talk in separate rooms. And so, they'd be looking at 10, 12, 15 kids, and the talks were similar, but as you were saying, Ash, answering different questions, and then they split into small groups from there. So that's one way they tackled it. I've seen churches who go during service, they go to worship together and then leave the back of the room and then separate into different. I mean, there's just 1,000 different ways to approach it. I think the point is it important enough to you strategically to think about it and try to come up with ways to reach different kids in different ways.
That's good.
The first church that I was on staff at, we gathered on a weekly basis, separate, like middle school and high school, but we would always do our events together when I first came on. Yeah. And so like summer camps, or whether you call it D Now or whatever that kind of weekend is for you. We always did it the same weekend because, as you know, events are so expensive, and the amount of volunteers you need to pull it off, and renting space or whatever it is.
Just the bus makes it worth it to combine.
Yeah, I know, right?
For cost.
And so when we were wrestling with this question, like when do we, so we're split in our environments on a weekly basis, but when do we split our events? Like how do you know? And so we started experimenting actually with it before we actually made the split. It was the same weekend. We called it Weekend 180. And it was the same weekend, except the middle school and high school ministries had different schedules. So like when the high school had large group, the middle school was eating. And then when high school went to small group, middle school went to large group, if that makes sense. And it was like a logistical headache.
Yes.
Like getting everything in place. Oh my goodness. But it really helped us figure out if we're going to invest these finances to do separate events, will it work? You know? So,
but that's a good way to do it. It is more complicated, and you do have to plan on the front end, but the resources and the time is still, the weekend's still done, and two separate. I don't know.
You can have the same band there.
Yeah.
You can have the same production people
if you're
there.
Go that big,
you know.
And I've seen some churches take that same rotating approach to Sundays, where you're feeding middle schoolers while high schoolers are worshiping, and then middle schoolers go to small group, high schoolers walk into worship, or high schoolers go to small group and middle schoolers walk into worship, and high schoolers eat on the back end, like that sort of thing. And I always think that's impressive, and you've probably got somebody really organized on your staff.
I know, right?
To figure out that rotating schedule.
The other thing I've seen is just using high schoolers to serve on, in the mornings while you have something for the middle. I mean, I think the fact that you can drive is important as far as when is the best time to have your environments. Again, if you have no youth room, at the church, it's hard to do that. But again, I've seen churches who they contact the coffee shop down the street, and then parents drop their middle schoolers off at the coffee shop and then come to church, and they have just found different ways to do it. I've seen churches in industrial parks who have talked to the business next door who doesn't have anything going on Sunday morning, and that they've used some space over there. So, I mean, people who really want to do this can get creative and make it happen.
I think about the importance of the influence of a high school student in the life of a middle schooler. And, as an adult, the age gap that exists between an adult and a middle school student can only be filled by a high school student, I think.
Yeah.
And it's just, for me, from the middle school side, I desperately want it to be an environment where high school students can be present. And that's not fair for a high school student if it's also their gathering to expect them to be pouring into the middle school students. But we really need them there.
It's funny. I was thinking the flip side of that is nothing has been more beneficial to the discipleship of the high schoolers I serve than serving as middle school small group leaders. It just takes them to a whole new place, a whole new level of responsibility. I had one just a few weeks ago say to me, hey, I need to share something with the group that I've been holding back because I want to be an example to the sixth graders I serve. Wow. I can't tell them to be open and honest with their group if I'm not open and honest with my group. And when I got done crying, I said, that was awesome.
That's awesome.
But that is awesome. I love it. I mean, we did that at our church that I just left, except for one service. We would have the high schoolers serve in the morning, and their environment was in the afternoon. And I loved high school small group leaders. They were often some of the best ones. And then, what was really cool. Well, we actually got picky. We would, we treated them like adults. And if they would not show up, they were fired, and people took it seriously because we would actually have more people who wanted to be eventually. It took a while to get there.
Eventually.
Yeah.
But, I can hardly even, my favorite thing to hear was when an 8th grader would leave and we wouldn't let 9th graders be small group leaders. We would have 10th graders start with 6th graders so that they would, think about the vision cast just in this statement. We have you start with 6th graders so when you graduate, you can finish with them.
Yeah.
Now, think about in this country how many seniors are finishing their programs. In fact, one of the last stats I pulled when I left North Point was how many 10th graders who started with 6th grade groups finished compared to how many 10th graders who were in the ministry finished as far as active.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's
Isn't
really
it interesting?
Yeah.
You want to know what it was?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was...
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
It was below 60%. We're still active. They still showed up every once in a while. We're still active.
Okay.
Some of them showed up once in a while. Some were long gone. And it was almost 90% finished who started with a 6th grade group.
Wow.
Whoa.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And just to your point, though, how much did not were they just engaged, but how much did their faith change?
Right.
I don't know if you guys feel this way, but when I was a teacher, after I taught a lesson, I still remember equations. I can tell you the equation, for the gravitational pull between two masses right now. Because I taught it. I mean,
That's something.
I haven't taught it in like 15 years,
Yeah.
but but I can tell that to you, and teaching something, especially when putting, kids in charge. I mean, and when kids ask questions, I'm telling you, it's just a really big deal. And, they just learn so much. So,
that reminds me of this, what was that called, Ash? The protege effect. You talked about this year on Orange Tour. Can you tell us what that is?
It was a bunch of studies that were done, and the one that stuck out to me the most was they studied the IQ of the oldest child in the family compared to their younger siblings. And I am not sharing this because I'm an oldest child. I'm the third of 4, and so this does not work to my advantage.
Me too. Please tell.
Sarah?
Middle.
Okay, so you and me are on the same page?
Oh, yeah.
So they studied the IQ of the oldest child, and what they found over and over again was that the oldest child's IQ was higher than the siblings.
What?
And they linked it back to the fact that the oldest child had...
I know. Can we take this off cut?
This is... You're totally the exception. I mean, and
you
I know.
haven't met my older sister.
Well, but they traced it back to the fact that the oldest child had to teach the younger siblings how to do things and explain their homework to them. And what it did
things
was...
your sister never did for you.
Right,
so.
clearly. But it helped them retain the information they were learning because they did something with it.
That's true. I mean, I see that with my own kids. My oldest teaching my youngest. That's interesting.
So we're saying the podcast, that having high school and middle school separate gives us this opportunity to engage high schoolers in service.
Yeah.
Which is
for me, that's
a
one of
good
the most
motivation to
compelling
separate.
reasons
As
to
Brené
separate, I think.
Brown says, you move what you're learning from your head to your heart through your hands. And it's so true.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I like what you said, Chef, too. You don't have to create completely separate ministries from the get-go. That even if you just start with separate small groups, because then you can start having the discussions, and you can ask the kinds of questions that are going to relate more to a middle schooler than a high schooler. So that you start there. It doesn't have to be this super overwhelming task of creating 2 different things.
Well, we run into that when we try to have our series aligned between middle and high school, so that a parent, as much as we can, a parent can have similar conversations, but the reality is the needs are quite different.
Yeah.
Take the, sexual integrity series.
Right.
What we're talking about with middle schoolers, is applicable to high schoolers, but we've got to go much more into the dating stuff for the older kids. And I mean, there are lots of differences, but in middle school, back at my old job, we used to pull just 6th grade out separately. And we would talk to them about just, some real general, well, I can't even say general stuff. It was important stuff.
Yeah.
But I just feel like everything's getting pushed back so far that's now a conversation that needs to happen in the 4th and 5th grade, just in the last 10 years. And 6th graders need to hear what our 7th and 8th graders needed to hear.
Well, that's an interesting point, too, that even if you have to have combined ministries, if there's some series that it is worth separating them out, even if it's not a permanent separation.
Yeah. Sarah, I really liked the way you put it as you were talking about all the different ways to make this happen, because I think sometimes the way we talk about separating our ministries, it sounds like there's only 2 options, A or B, separate or combined.
Right.
That's it. And that's really not true.
Yeah.
I mean, there's separate with combined small groups or combined with separate small groups. There's so many iterations of how this can happen. I don't know that it helps us to label ourselves as I'm separate or I'm combined.
Yeah.
Right.
I remember the first church I was on staff at, we had a student ministry staff. So our staff wasn't separate, but we had on the student ministry team, we had someone who was, thinking middle school and someone else who was thinking high school.
Right.
And when we would plan services from a programming standpoint, or even a small group leader standpoint, we would plan totally different, if middle and high school were going to be in the room, as opposed to if it was just going to be middle school. Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of how we function here when, as Chef, you were saying, the way that we create series.
Yeah.
Crystal, we have conversations all the time about what component does middle school need that high school probably doesn't need,
Right.
Or we'll even be talking about the same topic and we look at each other and we're like, we're probably gonna have to go different angles on this just because of where they are.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just have total different series because you needed to.
Yeah.
So.
But that's even good what you said, Chef, and that that church, I think you said in South Africa, had learned that you can have volunteers give your talks, or like for our curriculum that we do, we offer video communicators at times, so that you don't have to feel the pressure to be learning 2 different messages every single time you're.
In fact, I used to tell people all the time, it's easier to find a communicator than it is to find a good small group leader.
Boy, that's true, though.
But everybody wants to be the communicator, and everybody practices those things. And if you give them good notes and they know the kids, they can do a good job. I mean, but to find someone who's committed to small group leaders over time, that's
hard.
A tougher job. Yet we focus mostly on the program, right?
One of the coolest middle school environments I have ever seen was this middle school. Like, basically a church decided to split, and they gave middle school a room that was entirely too small for them. So it's already a challenge. And the youth pastor said, they have such short attention spans at this age that I don't want them to sit in a cramped environment too long. So he put 4, instead of 1 large stage at the front, he put 4 small stages in each corner and had a different communicator pop up on those stages. The maximum amount of time they were facing one direction was 7 minutes. And usually it was every 4 minutes. A communicator popped up on a different stage, and then your communicators were only bound to a 4-minute talk.
Yeah.
It's like TED Talk.
It was so cool. And the kids were like turning around the whole time. Yeah. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But that was such a middle school specific environment. I just thought it was a great reason to separate for them.
That's awesome.
So it seems that for the most part, if everyone had the budget and the space and the people, we would separate them out. But what would be the motivations for wanting to keep them together? How would that be a positive?
I mean, that's what you said, right? It's budget and space and volunteers.
Yeah.
It is, I think, sometimes easier for the 9th grade parent who also has a 7th grade child.
Yeah.
Right.
So
You're
true.
showing
That
up
is true.
one time at church, you're dropping them off one time at church and
parents,
picking
for
them
sure.
up. Or if you've got a 12th grade child and an 8th grade child, then one can drive the other. It creates a whole different set of issues for parents, I think,
Yeah.
when we separate out.
Well, I mean,
point.
when we made the decision to have a separate high school ministry, and that we wanted high schoolers to serve in the morning, and then we put the high school program at night in Atlanta, where it takes a minimum of 40 minutes to get anywhere, there was a hit. From 8th to 9th grade, there was a hit in attendance,
Yeah.
and 9th graders don't drive. So now they're dependent on someone else to get them somewhere in a place where it's hard to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And, and the Falcons are on TV. So your
Right.
driver now is, not wanting to go anywhere. So that definitely is a hit. So I could see that as a reason to try to come up with another plan. I know one interesting thing, church in Athens, Georgia, Athens Church, they took over an old strip mall, which was interesting. And and probably very few churches have this problem, but they had a ton of unused space, which was interesting.
Oh, wow.
And so they were having the problem of getting high school kids to come back in the afternoon, but they also loved the idea of having high school kids serve. And so they took a hunk of this space and that very unfinished, very cheaply just created a place to hang out, because again, the number one thing kids want are other kids. And then they have 2 services, which I love 2 services, whether you're full or not, because that allows someone to serve. You can serve and go to church in the morning. And once that happened, they had high school and middle school services separate. But the point wasn't, it wasn't expensive. It was more expensive.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, so a high school kid could come serve and get their group environment in the mornings, because it's so hard to get anywhere, and it's working from what I understand. So those of you with too much space, there's an idea. All 3 of you. Right.
Well, I think anytime you can run back-to-back services, though, whether it's middle school and high school, or middle school and children's, or adults and high school, anytime you're running back-to-back, you're giving families a chance to show up one time.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you're not forcing them to go home, have lunch, take a nap, wake up, and come back.
Well,
I think that's a good thing.
Before they got to this, they had middle school 1 hour and high school 1 hour, so that you could do both, but they outgrew it because it was so popular, which was great. And then it was like, what do we do? And so that was their next phase.
I think another reason maybe people would see keeping them together as a benefit, I'm thinking of youth pastors out there who are maybe bivocational.
Right.
And they're volunteering to lead this youth ministry. Their capacity is, limited.
Yeah.
I mean, their time is limited. And so I understand from if you're thinking the youth pastor's point of view,
right,
just simple energy wise, why that might be the way that, the direction they lean.
Yeah.
And I do think there's some value also in 7th graders seeing 9th graders worship. I think there's some value in 8th graders seeing 12th graders worship. There's some,
which is why
up to role model situations that
which is why having high school students in middle school ministry works
it's
in
great.
the same way.
Yeah.
But I get what you mean.
So it really feels like there are pros and cons to both. But if you had to give an answer to the question we came in asking is, should middle school and high school environments be combined? What would you say?
I mean, I would say, and maybe if you're listening, you've picked up on this, we all are a little biased toward separate. And in a lot of ways, that just comes out of the research we did a few years ago with the PHASE project that just pointed out all of the differences developmentally with where a middle schooler is and where a high schooler is. And then if you throw gender in there, I mean, where a 6th grade boy is compared to where an 8th grade or 9th grade girl is, it's just light years apart.
Right.
And I think you have, not only do you have distinct challenges at those ages, but you also have some distinct opportunities.
Right.
And you're going to miss them if you're trying to teach to the middle.
Right.
Which is why I think anytime you have combined environment and you're only doing a one-size-fits-all message, you're going to lose your 6th graders and your 12th graders.
There is no one size.
There is no one-size-fits-all.
Right.
And so... but like we said today, I don't think that the answer is, you have to have a completely separate ministry. It's not a question of separate or combined. It's a question of developmentally appropriate or not. And there are a lot of ways to accomplish being developmentally appropriate.
I think that's
so.
a great
What are
point.
some of those ways? How would you know if you're developmentally appropriate for middle school or high school?
That's a long answer, but I would say that the start of that is, have you considered it? I mean, I think this is less about separate programs and more about, in your mind, do you believe that these are two separate audiences? And then you've got to figure out the best way to speak to both those audiences with the situation that you're looking at at your church. And that's your leadership opportunity, right? I mean, leaders solve problems, right? So that's your problem. You've got to believe they're two audiences, and 2, you've got to figure out how to serve them best with the resources you have. If that's a lot of resources or a lot of space, great. You're going to have more problems to solve based on that. How are we going to staff it? How are we going to do all these other things? When are we going to do those things? If you don't have the resources to have it separate, or you don't even have a room and everybody meets Wednesday night, then figure out the best way, whether it's separate programs, rotating in and out, doing worship together, separating for talks. A
tent outside.
Like
The Greatest Showman.
A coffee shop, home groups, whatever it is, do the best you can.
Yeah.
I saw this church that had the problem of not enough space, and I thought it was so fascinating. In their children's ministry, they had 700 kids and 200 adult attenders.
Oh my gosh.
That's fascinating. And in order to deal with the space challenge, they just invited everybody who owned a minivan to park their minivan in the parking lot, and small groups met in minivans.
I love this so much. It's like the drive-in movie theater, but
I thought it was so
sounds
creative.
Kind of creepy.
Hey, children,
come into my minivan. But it doesn't have to be creepy at all. Just do your background checks.
Just offer candy.
Background checks no matter what.
Van. It's fine.
Yeah.
That was very innovative.
Super innovative. I've seen
resourceful.
Yeah.
Where did I see it? The churches that are meeting in schools, they set up tents. I've seen tents used in separate,
I have seen that.
That's been interesting. I've seen people build these sliding walls that come out and separate rooms the best they can. Just work with what you can work with.
That's good. Thanks for joining us for the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love you to subscribe to the podcast through your podcast app. And while you're there, we would love for you to leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing and what we can do to make this podcast better. And finally, for more great resources, check out the show notes for this episode and learn more about the student curriculum and strategy we're all a part at Orange. Visit our website, rethinkingym.org. Until next time, thanks for listening.